specific subjects. I am Monojit Majumdar. Hello, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to a new edition of the Indian Express Explained Live, earlier known as E-Explained, our series of online explanatory conversations with domain experts and authorities on specific subjects. I am Monojit Majumdar, editor for explanatory journalism at the Indian Express. We think of Explained, the content in our paper, on our website, as well as in events such as this one, as being rooted in the news, but going beyond just the news. So it is context, it is background, it is analysis, it's connecting the dots. It's a mix which gives you a fuller understanding of what is just the news. This evening, we are talking about diplomacy and strategic and international affairs, specifically about India's most important bilateral relationship, that with the United States of America, as the Joe Biden, Kamala Harris administration prepares to take over in Washington, D.C. How did the India-US relationship fare in the 4 years of Donald Trump from 2016 to 2020? And what can be expected in the coming 4 years under Biden and Harris? India and the US are already very strong partners. Where could the way forward be smoother, and where could the relationship encounter hurdles? To discuss some of these questions and issues around them or emanating from them, we have with us this evening the former Indian ambassador to the United States, Arun Singh, a keen observer and insightful analyst of the evolution of the bilateral relationship over the years. Ambassador Singh, welcome to the Indian Express.
Thank you.
We thank you for your time, sir, and we are honored to host you. Arun Singh was India's ambassador in Washington, D.C. through 2015-16. Before that, he was Deputy Chief of Mission from October 2008 to April 2013. Obviously, he saw the workings of the Barack Obama administration very closely at a time when then Vice President Joe Biden played an important role in the shaping of U.S. policy towards India. Speaking with Ambassador Singh will be my colleague Shubhajit Roy, Associate Editor and Chief Diplomatic Correspondent at the Indian Express. Shubho, you have written extensively on the India-US relationship for many years and are a bit of an expert on the subject yourself. After about 45 minutes of what I'm sure will be an absolutely fascinating conversation, we will open the floor for a limited number of questions from you, the audience. Thank you, all of you, for joining us. Welcome once again. Shubho.
Thank you. Thank you, Monojit, for that generous introduction. It's indeed a privilege for me to host Mr. Singh, who I've known for many, many years now, and who, as Monojit, you pointed out, was stationed in Washington, D.C. for 6 out of 8 years of the Obama-Biden administration. First as the Deputy Chief of Mission, and then as the ambassador. Now, having covered foreign affairs for a decade and more, now I can say with certain degree of confidence that outside the current Indian government, I think there is no one who has a deeper understanding of the incoming Biden administration as Mr. Singh. Before I move on to our interaction, I would like to set the context for this particular discussion, for this particular session. And for that, there is a brief sort of presentation that we have for you. Can we have the slides, please? So first things first, let's look at the trajectory of the Indo-US relationship over the last 7 decades. Now, this is not a sort of a exhaustive list, but it encapsulates the key markers of this particular relationship in the last 7 decades. If you see on your screen, from 1949 onwards, when Nehru visited the US, we had a series of visits in 59, 78, then 82. But actually, the turning point in the relationship came through when India tested the nuclear devices for the second time in 1998. And that is when the relationship, really the contours of the relationship really changed. And after that, there were talks between Jaswant Singh and Strobe Talbot, which led to a sort of a thaw in the relationship because there were sanctions put by the US administration then. And then there was this Bill Clinton's visit in 2000, and the US lifted the sanctions in 2001. 2005 is another landmark year when the civilian nuclear deal was first drafted. Can we move on to the next slide, please? And in 2008, as we now know, that the NSG gave the exemption for the Indo-US nuclear deal. The president, Barack Obama, he visited India in 2010 and when actually the US for the first time expressed its support for the UN Security Council. After that, there were visits by Prime Minister Manmohan Singh in 2013. In 2014, current Prime Minister Narendra Modi made his first high-profile US visit. And 2015, Obama was the first and the only US president to visit India for the second time, and for the 26th January Republic Day celebrations. Then in 2017, Donald Trump and Prime Minister Modi met for the first time. And earlier this year, in February, just before the pandemic sort of hit India in its full flow, President Trump, he visited India. Next slide, please. Now, this was broadly the contours of the relationship I explained to you. Now, let's look at who is President-elect Joseph R. Biden Jr. He has a long political career of 47 years, and he entered the US Senate in 1973. Now, just to give you a context of what this means, the longevity and the deep and political experience of Joe Biden, amongst the Indian politicians, Pranab Mukherjee became the minister in Indira Gandhi government for the first time in 1973. Similarly, L.K. Advani became a Rajya Sabha member in 1970. Another context, to put it in context for we Indian sports lovers, is, three of India's top sports persons, Sachin Tendulkar, Rahul Dravid, and Leander Paes were born in the year 1973. So this gives you a real sense of the longevity of Joe Biden as a politician, as a political player in the US. He made two presidential bids that we know in 1987 and 2007. 2016, he was nudged to not run for the presidency when Hillary Clinton got the Democratic nomination. But the key thing about from his perspective, from India's perspective, if we see his career, he became a member of US Senate Foreign Relations Committee in 1997. Now, if you really see the India's transformation, Indo-US relationship, the time period that it transformed was in the last 2 decades. And he has been on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for those 2 decades. And he chaired twice, once from 2001 to 2003, and again from 2007 to 2009. Now, if you remember, 2001 to 2003 was the time period when the thaw in the relationship actually began, in the sense that with Clinton's visit, and then Vajpayee also visited, and then again 2007 to 2009, the Indo-US nuclear deal was wrapped up, was signed between India and the United States. So he played a key role in developing the consensus on the Indo-US nuclear deal. And he last visited India as vice president in July 2013. Next slide, please. So he, as we know now, that he's been a strong advocate of strengthening the Indo-US partnership, especially in strategic areas. He was in the government, in the administration when India was named as a major defense partner, which is the first such country to be given such status. In fact, the only country to be given that status outside the alliance system that the United States follows. And also the first of the three foundational pacts were also signed in the last months of the Obama-Biden administration. And after that, we all know that the Trump administration wrapped up the two other foundational agreements, which is COMCASA and BECA, which was signed recently in October this year. Next slide, please. So Biden's policy and vision, what we know, here we've looked at a few major issues in which he has made his views known through his campaign document or his public speeches. On terrorism, which is obviously for India, it's a very major concern. He says, his campaign document says there can be no tolerance from terrorism in South Asia, cross-border or otherwise. Now, cross-border terrorism is obviously a sort of a signal to a reference to Pakistan-sponsored terrorism, and that is very important for India. On China, his administration has said, his campaign document has said that his administration will support a rules-based and stable Indo-Pacific region in which no country, including China, is able to threaten its neighbors with impunity. Now, that is something, again, an important issue for India, especially at a time when we have a border standoff going on for the last 6 months with China. On immigration, which has been a major concern for India, and the issue of visas, where there's always been a threat of tightening, especially during the last 4 years during Trump administration, he has promised to support liberalizing the visa regime and a host of initiatives to support family-based immigration or reform the temporary visa system for high-skilled specialty jobs, which is essentially the H-1B visa issue, and other such issues. Next slide, please. And on the human rights issue, which is again an issue which is the Democratic Party is very, very vocal about and articulate about, is again another sort of issue that in which there could be challenges for the Indian government, the Indo-US relationship in the years ahead. We will discuss more of that during the conversation. He had expressed disappointment with the Indian government on NRC and CAA. And also his campaign document talks about shared democratic values, free and fair elections, and freedom of expression and religion. His vision for TIPES, this is very telling because, back in the day when in 2006, before he became the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in December 2006, Biden had said that my dream is that in the year 2020, the two closest nations in the world will be India and the United States. Now, I think he has an opportune moment in that sense to realize this particular dream now. Next slide, please. So that's where we are. Now, with this, I would like to sort of go to the question answer session with Ambassador Singh. And let me pose you the first question, Ambassador Singh, that now you watched Obama-Biden administration for almost 6 out of 8 years, as we know. What do you think will be the priorities of the Biden-Kamala Harris administration?
Thank you, Shubhajit. So first, I want to compliment you for the very comprehensive introduction that you gave. setting the context for what's happening in the US, what's happening in the India-US relationship. And before responding to your question, with your permission, if I could just add a couple of nuances to the context that you had set. As you noted, President Clinton visited India in 2000. And that visit started the new phase in the relationship, because before that, we had done the nuclear tests in 1998, and then the US had imposed sanctions on India. But before the Clinton visit, the last US president to visit India was President Carter in 1978. And there was a 22-year gap between those two visits. Since then, every US president has visited India. And that is one reflection of the change that is happening. Again, interestingly, President Clinton and President Bush visited in their second terms, and Clinton towards the end of his second term, last year of his second term. But President Obama, of course, came twice, as you mentioned, came on our Republic Day, and no US president has done that before that, even though we are a democracy. And Republic Day is the day we celebrate the adoption by India of its democratic constitution. But President Trump also visited in his first term. So we have to note that it's one of the sort of reflections of the changes happening. And I was intrigued to note that Monojit, in his introduction, said that the India-US relationship, for India is the most important bilateral relationship. And that is not something that would have been said some years ago, because people would have talked to the Soviet Union, they would have talked of Russia. The very fact that comfortably journalists, analysts, strategic thinkers now define the US relationship as being the most important relationship for India, the most important bilateral relationship, is a reflection of the changes that have happened. Now, given that, the priorities that the Biden-Kamala Harris administration are going to set for themselves is clearly going to impact on the economic relationship with India and the strategic dimensions of issues that are of concern to India. On November 8th morning, India time, in their sort of victory speech after the trend in the election results became clear, President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris both articulated that there will be 4 priorities for their administration. First, dealing with the pandemic, because that has had a devastating impact in the United States. The largest number of infections are in the United States. As of today, almost 15 million people have been infected, and infections are spreading rapidly all across the country. And new lockdowns are being imposed in many parts of the United States. In the US, there have been almost 300,000 deaths. Today, the daily rate of infections is more than 200,000. So you can see the dimension of the crisis and the need to deal with that, because that is having an impact on families, that is having an impact on politics. And even the response to the pandemic has been politicized, because the Democrats have been pushing for restrictions, wearing masks, and the Republicans, because they wanted to minimize the impact on the economy, have sort of de-emphasized the need for wearing masks. They wanted to keep the economy open. And the second aspect that they have emphasized is dealing with the economic situation. Till January this year, the US economy was doing very well. Unemployment was at historically low levels, around 3%. But after that, the economy went into a deep dive. Unemployment level rose almost to 15%. Now it is estimated to be at around 10%. Large number of people have opted out of the workforce. And the US needs to get its economy back on track. And that is going to be the second priority. In the context of the second priority, they're also going to focus on the challenge from China, because there is a recognition in the United States that going ahead, their major competitor, economic competitor, technological competitor, military competitor at the global level is going to be China, and that's something that they have to deal with. The third priority that they have identified for themselves is dealing with the challenge of systemic racism within US society. And that has been a long-standing problem. Some months ago, there was violence, there were riots in some places in the US, protests all across the United States against high-handed police action against minorities, especially African Americans. And that itself was a reflection of the problem that US faces as a society. And you're saying the problem related to the elections today. very unusual for the United States. The incumbent president is challenging the outcome of the elections. He has said, in fact, even before the votes were cast, that the only way he could lose would be if the elections were rigged and there was massive fraud in the system. And after the elections, he continues to make that claim. And it's not just he's making the claim or is filing cases before courts, but very recently, the Attorney General of Texas filed a plea before the US Supreme Court asking the results in 4 states, Georgia, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, to be thrown out. And this was joined by attorneys general of 17 states in the United States, where there are Republican attorneys general, and 126 members of the US House, Republicans, almost 50% of the representation in the US House of Representatives, joined in that. Now, that is a reflection of deep division within US society. And part of the problem is that Republicans in the United States, who capture the vote of the white majority population, non-college educated population, see a threat to themselves because of the rising number of immigrants and minority groups in the US. And through voter suppression, through gerrymandering of districts, through various mechanisms, and making it difficult for people to vote. For example, this time they've been canvassing against mail-in voting. They want to prevent the newer immigrants or minority groups from being able to vote in full measure. So that's, again, another problem that the US society faces, and the Biden-Harris potential administration has said that it will be a priority for them. And the fourth priority that they've set for themselves is dealing with the climate change. And again, here they want to distinguish themselves from the Trump administration, because under President Trump, issues related to climate change have been de-emphasized. He has said that this is not serious, it is not evidence-based. Regulations in the US related to mining, exploration were eased in a big way. And the Democrats, especially the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, is pushing very hard for the challenge to climate change, the global warming, to be recognized and to be handled on a science-based framework. And therefore, that is going to get some priority. And as you have noted, President-elect Biden has already nominated former Secretary of State John Kerry to be a special envoy on climate change issues, but also give him a seat at the table of the National Security Council in the United States. And thereby, he will bring those issues for direct discussions from a national security perspective and giving it added emphasis. So these are among the priorities that the new administration will be setting for itself as it comes into office in January. And President-elect Biden has said that he will rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement on day one, soon convene a meeting of major emitters to see how they can address issues related to climate change, and also that he will convene a summit of democracies further down the line in the first year of his administration to deal with the challenge from increasing authoritarianism around the world. And that is also a subtle message to the challenge that China poses to the United States.
Summit for democracies and challenge from China. I think you've just set it out very wonderfully, the context for the discussion ahead. And that's where I want to unpack each of these issues. And talking about the challenge from China, one of the things, Ambassador Singh, one of the things that Trump made it clear was framing China as a strategic rival and a threat to the US. Now, this is quite different from what Obama had in mind. Now, at a time when the US has backed India during this long border standoff, now more than 6 months, and with no resolution in sight, how do you think would the Biden administration act?
No, I think that's a very important question, Shubhajit, and a lot of people in India, not just in India, even in the US and elsewhere, have been trying to figure out as to how would a Biden administration assess and respond to the China challenge. And they've been partly concerned because of the some vacillation that was seen during the Obama administration. Because when the Obama administration initially came in 2009, for the first couple of years, they spoke of strategic reassurance to China. And the idea was that it was possible for both United States and China to deal with their differences within a framework of a cooperative relationship and address each other's concerns. And they also set up a strategic and economic dialogue with China, where a large number of cabinet ministers from both sides used to come for meetings and discuss political issues, defense-related issues, economic issues, to see if some harmonization could be brought into their policy. Now, in the second phase of the Obama administration, they moved away from strategic reassurance. And there was a recognition that China was becoming a major competitor for the United States, and that China, especially after 2012, especially under President Xi, was becoming more emphatic in terms of pushing its own interests. Because before that, the Chinese policy used to be what has been described as hide and bide. Hide your strength, bide your time, and wait till you have become in a position to challenge your competitors. But since 2012, China has been talking of the China dream, China emerging as a major industrial country by 2025, becoming a global leader in technology. So they started seeing China as a rival, and there was talk initially of a pivot to Asia. And that was signaled that China would now be seen differently. But then there were some within the Obama administration who argued that pivot is too strong a word. We don't want to signal that China is necessarily a rival. So they started talking of a rebalance to Asia. So some softening of the language, but still a signal that there is a challenge from China that has to be dealt with. But even that rebalance to Asia, the Obama administration was not able to carry out, because in Europe, its challenges continued. It felt that initially that Russia would not be a major challenge for them. You may recall that in 2012 presidential election, one of the contender, Mitt Romney, when he had been asked, had said that Russia is the major challenge for the United States. And President Obama had decried that and poo-pooed that and said that Russia is a regional power. It's not a major challenge. But despite saying that, because of what they saw from their perspective in terms of Russia's actions in Georgia, Russia's actions in Ukraine, they needed to sustain their presence and military presence in Europe. And therefore, they could not quite divert the resources to Asia that they felt was necessary to deal with the China challenge. And also, they wanted to draw down their presence in West Asia. In 2009, soon after he had become president, President Obama had given a major speech in Cairo in terms of a different approach to the Islamic world, different approach to countries in West Asia, North Africa, different from what had been done during the Bush administration, and moving away from use of military power to diplomacy and reducing the military footprint of the United States in that part of the world, focus more on Asia. But with all the ferment happening in West Asia, continued conflicts, continued internal instability, he was not able to carry out that policy. So what they had visualized as something necessary to be done in Asia, in the Asia-Pacific region, they were not able to quite carry out. President Trump himself, in the beginning, gave mixed signals. You may recall that early in his tenure, he invited Chinese President for a visit to Mar-a-Lago, to his place in Florida. And it was portrayed as a major sort of step being taken to build a new relationship with President Xi, with China. There were people in his administration, his own son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who has an advisor's role, who was engaged in building a positive relationship with China. The Treasury Secretary, Secretary Mnuchin, was also involved in building a positive relationship with China. Henry Kissinger, who started the new relationship for the US with China in 1971, was among the advocates of a very positive relationship with China. So there was a major struggle within the Trump administration, and business based in the Wall Street and the financial sector of the US economy was also pushing for a positive relationship with China. But eventually, the Trump administration, the balance swung in favor of those who were described as trade hawks because of the huge Chinese trade surpluses with the US. And since 2017, December, in the national security strategy, then the national defense strategy in 2018, and subsequently, the Trump administration clearly defined China as a major global rival, a strategic competitor, took a whole set of measures related to tariffs on supplies from China. And today, through a series of steps, has defined the Chinese Communist Party as a major threat to the US way of life, has tightened visas on members of the Chinese Communist Party, has tried to tighten visas on Chinese students and scholars coming to the United States, and has sanctioned Chinese technology companies dealing with, for example, Huawei, ZTE, and others. Now, when you look at what Joe Biden has said and what people around him have said, including Tony Blinken, who's now been designated as the next Secretary of State, or Jake Sullivan, who's been announced as the next National Security Advisor, they have clearly said that the situation today is very different from the situation in 2016. China follows unfair trade practices. China is a major technological rival to the United States. The way China has behaved in the context of the pandemic, and after that, the kind of wolf warrior diplomacy China has been following, that is a challenge for the United States that the US has to deal with, and it will deal with China differently from the way it dealt with China in the period before 2016. So I would believe that there will be some nuance because they'll want to show that they're different from the Trump administration. And some have said that, Trump was very aggressive on China towards the end, but Biden would be more effective on China because Biden has said that he will also bring in allies and partners to have a common approach towards China. Because although the US under Trump had taken a very aggressive approach towards China, the Europeans didn't follow him because he had decried alliance relationship. But if the US wants an effective policy on China, it needs to bring its allies in Europe and Asia on a common platform to respond to the China challenge. And so those around Biden have suggested that because of his reaching out to allies and partners, Biden would be more effective in responding to the China challenge. We have to see how it plays out.
Thank you, Ambassador Singh, for laying out the whole evolution of the thought process in Washington from the Obama administration until now. You talked about allies and partners, that alliances that the US and the Biden administration would like to forge when they want to take on China, want to forge those relationships. Now, one of the outcomes of that partnership has been Quad. That we have seen. The Quad foreign ministers have met twice. Once was on the sidelines of the UNGA, but the second one was, interestingly, was a standalone meeting for which External Affairs Minister Jaishankar, he flew down to Tokyo in the middle of the pandemic when all other meetings were happening through virtual mode. And he and all the others came down in Tokyo to discuss the issues about Indo-Pacific, about China, and other such issues. Now, what is the future of Quad under the Biden administration?
Again, I think, Chuj, is a very important question. Clearly, the Quad made much more progress under the Trump administration. Because earlier, there were some meetings at the mid-official level, but it was only in the framework of the Trump administration that the meetings began at the foreign minister level. And for some time, there was a meeting at the foreign minister level on the margins of UN General Assembly. But now they've had a standalone foreign minister meeting in Tokyo, as you mentioned. Quad, of course, had started earlier. There were some meetings of the Quad way back in 2007. After that, it slipped a little because Australia lost interest in the process because of its own relationship with China and wanted to focus on the economic dimension of the relationship with China. But now, as all countries, be it Australia, Japan, India, United States, are facing similar challenges, I mean, different but similar in many ways from China, there is a recognition of some harmonization of work in the Indo-Pacific region. Now, here I would mention that it was President Obama, when he visited India in January 2015, that there was a joint statement that had been issued which spoke of joint strategic vision for the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. So the idea started sort of concretizing way back then. You may also recall that in 2011, the then Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, had visited India. During that visit, she went to Chennai. And in Chennai, and the place was very carefully selected by them on the east coast of India, facing towards the Pacific, and had given a major speech talking about the bilateral relationship with India, but also cooperation with India in the framework of the Pacific. So although the Trump administration has certainly advanced the concept of the Quad, advanced the concept of cooperation with India in the framework of the Indo-Pacific, because this term had been used and popularized by the Trump administration. It was in the Trump administration that the US Pacific Command, based in Hawaii, was renamed the Indo-Pacific Command. At the same time, if you see the conversations that President-elect Biden has had with the Prime Minister of Japan, Prime Minister of Australia, President of South Korea, after those conversations, in the statement that has been put out by the US side, there's a reference to the Indo-Pacific. And therefore, it's a recognition that in some areas, they will recognize and build on the positive work that has been done by the Trump administration. So I would believe that given the evolution in the global situation, given the evolution in the US-China rivalry and competition, both the strategic framework of cooperation in the context of the Indo-Pacific and using the Quad for enhancing interaction and network of relationships between India, US, Japan, and Australia will continue.
The next important issue from India's perspective is how does the US administration under Biden look at Pakistan? Now, when I say Pakistan, I would underline India's concerns on Pakistan-sponsored cross-border terrorism. We all remember how Trump had lashed out at Pakistan's poor track record in combating terrorism in the famous New Year's Day tweet in January 2018. Now, what would be Biden's approach? Would there be any change? Would there be any evolution? Would he be softer on Pakistan?
So, Shubhajit, I would say each country defines its policies and priorities based on its own interests and not because of the interest of another country. And US will define its approach to Pakistan based on how it perceives its own interests being served by a particular kind of relationship with Pakistan. And from India's perspective, we have to see where is the convergence and divergence in that. Now, if you look at President Trump, in the beginning, he took a very harsh line on Pakistan. And in the tweet, as you said, he spoke about Pakistan hoodwinking the United States, fooling the United States, taking a lot of money and not providing enough support. He stopped assistance to Pakistan. And yet last year, he welcomed the Pakistan Prime Minister Imran Khan to the White House, soon after having joined the Indian Prime Minister in September in Houston for that major rally in front of 50,000 Indian Americans. And in that meeting with the Pakistan Prime Minister, he said, and something that it was completely not based on facts, and that, one, that he's ready to mediate on Kashmir, and that the Indian Prime Minister had asked him to mediate on Kashmir between India and Pakistan, which just couldn't be true. And the Indian Foreign Minister had to make a statement in Parliament saying that there is no basis to that. Since then, the rhetoric from President Trump on Pakistan has come down because they need Pakistan in the context of Afghanistan. Today, the United States wants to get out of Afghanistan. President Trump ideally would have wanted to bring the US military presence in Afghanistan down to zero. He has brought it down now to about 2,500. For that, they need to have a continued dialogue with the Taliban. And they believe that they need cooperation from Pakistan for dialogue with the Taliban if some kind of reconciliation can progress between the Taliban and the government in Afghanistan. And because of that, the sharpness of their rhetoric and action related to Pakistan has come down. The only thing they have done is they have maintained Pakistan in the grey list of the Financial Action Task Force. as a pressure point, that if we don't get enough cooperation from you, we can put you on the blacklist, and then the Pakistani financial sector can be hit. So that pressure has been maintained, but the sharpness of rhetoric has come down. Now, the US has traditionally struggled with a policy on Pakistan, whether to incentivize Pakistan or to pressurize Pakistan. Sometimes they try to incentivize them, sometimes they try to pressurize them. And the Obama administration, for example, in 2011, when Osama bin Laden had been found in Pakistan at Abbottabad near a Pakistani military academy, the relation with Pakistan had suffered tremendously for more than a year. And Pakistan had also, around that time, blocked US military supplies going through Pakistan for the troops in Afghanistan. But then later in 2016, at a time when the Obama administration wanted to incentivize Pakistan to give them more cooperation in Afghanistan, they offered Pakistan again F-16 aircraft. And, the Indian embassy, the Indian government had to work very hard to lobby the US Congress to block that sale. And that sale was eventually blocked. I think it's something that all US administrations have struggled with. If you looked at President Bush, for example, in 2006, at a time when Pakistan was heavily involved in providing support to the Taliban to attack US forces in Afghanistan, and then providing support to terrorist groups active against India. Standing next to Musharraf at Camp David, President Bush said, here's a president who is standing right with us. And so, I think this has been their dilemma. Since 2001, they have needed Pakistan because the only cost-effective way for them to supply US troops in Afghanistan is through Pakistan. They cannot send supplies through Iran because of the difficulties in their relationship with Iran. The alternative route through Russia and Central Asia is very long, very expensive. They had used that for more than a year when Pakistan had blocked supplies in 2011, 2012. But again, that's not a cost-effective route. And now they have difficulties in their relationship with Russia. So the only way that the land route availability they have for supplying their troops is through Pakistan. And that, gives Pakistan some leverage. So they're struggling with this policy. I would believe that a Biden administration would be clear-eyed about the nature of the Pakistani state, its involvement with terrorist groups. We spoke about the comment that President-elect Biden has made about unacceptability of cross-border terrorism. And it's a very important message. So they will recognize that. But they will have a certain need for cooperation from Pakistan in the context of Afghanistan, and that will limit the extent of pressure they can generate on Pakistan. We have to be mindful of that, and we have to work our way around that.
Right. So they need Pakistan to access Afghanistan. So that has been one of the major challenges, major dilemmas that U.S. administration has always faced and struggled with, as you rightly pointed out. And now, there's an interlinked issue in this, that access through Iran. Now, India has projects, especially the strategically important Chabahar port project, and the connectivity it offers with Afghanistan, the access it offers with Afghanistan. Now, with President Biden in, he would like to go back to the JCPOA, which the P5+1 countries negotiated with Iran. Now, from which the US under Trump administration had walked out. Now, do you think that with Biden administration in place, the Chabahar port project would get fast-tracked? Or you think Biden will be under pressure to renegotiate the JCPOA and things may not move as fast as is expected?
So there are two sets of issues here, Shubhajit. One is related to Chabahar project. Now, even before the JCPOA had been signed in 2015, the US had sanctions on Iran. And under those sanctions, and that was the time of the Obama administration, this was as a result of pressure that had come from US Congress. And sanctions had been imposed on Iran, under which every country had to bring down significantly its imports of oil from Iran. And all countries did that. China did that, Japan did that, South Korea did that, India also did that, and that was happening. But in that legislation that had come from US Congress, there was a specific carve-out for Chabahar because we were able to make a convincing argument to the leadership in US Congress and the US administration that the Chabahar port project was important for Afghanistan and for India being able to supply humanitarian assistance, economic connectivity to Afghanistan, and that there was a convergence of interest between India and the United States related to Afghanistan. So in the US legislation, there was a carve-out for Chabahar, and therefore work on Chabahar was not sanctionable. And of course, post JCPOA, that continues. So that carve-out exists. So technically, the work on Chabahar, so long as it is linked to the effort to provide stability in Afghanistan, does not come under US sanctions. But what happens is that interpretation of regulations gets complicated. And private companies, financing entities, shipping companies don't want to risk coming under sanctions. And therefore, they become extra careful. And therefore, they may not be very keen to invest in projects at Chabahar. They may not be very keen to send ships for Chabahar, just to be extra careful and avoid. So, as you said, if the US has a less adversarial relationship with Iran, private companies get more comfortable in engaging in certain kind of activities, and that may help in further development of the projects around Chabahar. But we have to also watch what happens in Afghanistan. If the Taliban and the Afghan government are able to reach agreement, if there is stability in Afghanistan, and if the future framework in Afghanistan is something that the US is comfortable with and is not a challenge through terrorist actions to the United States, the US would once again be more positive in terms of the role of the Chabahar port in terms of stabilization in Afghanistan. And we have to approach it in that framework. Of course, there is a different dimension to the US that, exports of oil from Iran and other things become possible because those are available to India at better rates. But that's something that, the Gulf politics has to work out between the US, Israel, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iran, and that's complicated.
Right, that's complicated. Now, let me come to the complicated neighborhood that India lives in. Now, when we talk of China, Pakistan, the twin challenges India faces in its neighborhood, India's engagement with the US has increased in the last decade and a half or so. Now, I'm talking here about the defense relationship. Now, from India being designated as the major defense partner to signing the foundational agreements, there are a host of things that have been done. Biden was in the administration when the process actually began towards this, the major defense partner, his role in that particular, status being granted to India. Now, having seen the trajectory of the relationship, what can now Biden do next when it
in defense? In 2008, when US was able to work out and sign the civil nuclear cooperation agreement with India, while it certainly enabled cooperation in the civilian dimensions of nuclear energy, it also released higher level technology cooperation between the two countries. And that enabled the US to provide higher technology, defense equipment and platforms to India. And so since then, India has contracted to buy almost $20 billion of defense supplies from US, some of them very important long-haul platforms, helicopters and other things that you referred to. One initiative that had been taken at the time of the Obama-Biden administration was the Defense Trade and Technology Initiative, and that had been pushed by the then Defense Secretary Ashton Carter, where it was said that it was not just that India would buy more supplies from the US, but also that there should be cooperation in technology areas. Now, that has not progressed very much. So one would hope that under the Biden administration, if more cooperation in technology related to defense between the two countries is facilitated, that would deepen. And I think certainly we would want more production to happen in India. You may recall that during the last meeting of the India-US 2+2, I think it was at the end of October in New Delhi, when the RM at the press conference spoke about Indian companies becoming part of the global supply chain for US defense manufacturers and for MROs also being set up in India. So if our defense companies can become a part of supplies for major US manufacturers, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, and others, that would again deepen cooperation in this area. Going beyond that, we are already doing large number of military exercises, army exercises, naval exercises, air force, tri-services exercises. The US has says that it does more bilateral exercises with India than with any other country, including, NATO, of course, they have multilateral exercises, but if you're just looking at the bilateral exercises. And I think for India, the picture is very similar. So that again reflects the habit of working together, building habits of cooperation. So going ahead, I would hope that based on India's assessment of its own needs, because that has to be the primary requirement, India is able to access higher level technology from the US in defense. Second, that production in India on defense related issues is enabled further, including in partnership with the US companies.
Right. The other aspect, a strong partnership is there, a cooperation is there between India and US in the Indo-US counter-terrorism cooperation. And, it was fortuitous that within weeks of the elections in 2008, when Obama and Biden won the US presidential elections, the 26/11 Mumbai terror attacks took place. And the Indo-US counter-terrorism cooperation has just gone strength to strength from there onwards. Now, you were there in the US during that time. How did this play out? Avril Haines, the new director of national intelligence nominee, and others in the team. How and which way will that change when the Biden administration comes in play?
So you're right. In fact, when 26/11 happened, 2008, I happened to be in the US. I had just about a month ago joined there as the Deputy Chief of Mission at the embassy. And I was having an official meeting when the event started playing out in India. And of course, at that time, it was the George Bush administration. And one could see that there was certainly a lot of concern from the administration. President Obama had already been, elected. And again, as per tradition in the US, although there's a president-elect, there is only one president at a time. And he had reached out to the embassy to convey his condolence. But it was clear that there was only one president who was taking the decisions. But you could see that although they were certainly very strong on aspects related to terrorism, they also had compulsions related to Pakistan because of their dependence on Pakistan related to Afghanistan. And the whole effort was to try and sort of temper down the tension between the two countries. And that was the direction in which they were headed. But I think it's more because the US realizes that terrorism based in Pakistan is a threat to its own interests. Because terrorist groups based in Pakistan are linked, of course, with Taliban. They are linked to Al-Qaeda. Many of the Al-Qaeda people have been caught in safe houses belonging to the Lashkar-e-Toiba. There have been links between the Jaish-e-Mohammed and the Al-Qaeda Taliban. So because of this network of relationships, you cannot segment the various terrorist groups. So they see a threat to themselves from the safe haven that terrorists and terrorist groups find in Pakistan. Therefore, they approach it from that perspective. Second, any increase of tensions between India and Pakistan, if they see it as impacting negatively on the pursuit of their interests, then they would try to see if the tensions can be brought down, especially their interests in Afghanistan. So they approach it from this perspective. But I have found that on the general issue of terrorism, they've been supportive of India, supportive of India's concerns, and worked to enable India to respond to it even more effectively.
Right. Before I move on to questions, I would sort of want to ask you on the, we have talked a lot about the convergences between the two countries. Let me now go towards the area of divergences. Now, the issue of immigration became a big issue in the last few years, last 4 years especially with the constant threat of tightening of the H-1B visas. Now, one cannot ignore that, almost half, at least more than 40% Americans did vote for Mr. Trump. Now, as former Foreign Secretary Vijay Gokhale said in a piece in the Indian Express recently, that, and I quote him here, that beyond the optics, the Trump Americans, who are the new political base, will still shape American policy irrespective of who the president is. Now, what is your assessment of where is the Biden's policy headed towards when it comes to this issue?
So I'll certainly respond first to your question on immigration, but I must just flag for you for later discussion that one area where there will be a divergence would be on Russia. And that's an important area that I think both sides will have to live with. But we'll come back to that. But on immigration, I think the Biden campaign has made it clear, and you also covered that in the slides that you brought about, that they would be not as harsh on immigration issues as the Trump administration has been. Trump administration policies have vacillated at times. They've been very strict in enforcement, at certain times not so strict. At one stage they had said that those under H-4 visas, that is spouse and dependents, the spouses of those under H-1B would not be allowed to work, but that was not enforced in a major way. But suddenly in the early part of this year, they said they would not give any fresh H-1 visas till the H-1B visas till the end of the year. And that was certainly a negative impact on Indian companies. So the Biden administration has signaled that they would not be as restrictive. They've also signaled that they recognized the high-skilled immigrant worker, including the high-skilled Indian immigrant worker, contributes to the United States remaining in the lead in technology globally. And if you go to Silicon Valley, you can see that Indian origin tech entrepreneurs, Indian origin tech workers are an integral part of US leadership in technology and innovation. More than a third of startups in Silicon Valley set up by immigrant entrepreneurs are by Indian origin entrepreneurs. So they recognize that. But this is a challenge that I had seen also at the time of the Obama administration. Even then, there was a phase when the visa fees for H-1B workers of certain category of companies, which impacted on Indian companies very much, were raised 3 times. So this is a pressure that the US system faces. They want to get more skilled workers because they feel it helps the US. The US Chamber of Commerce, for example, has come out with a statement critical of the Trump administration restrictions on immigration. But at the same time, many US workers who are unemployed, who lose jobs, they start generating a political campaign and advocacy that they're losing jobs because of the H-1B immigrant worker. And that generates pressure on congressmen, senators to try and restrict that. So I think the Biden administration would also have to work its way through these. But you may have seen that in the US Congress, there is a move to remove the country caps on green cards. And that will benefit the Indian origin workers, because the biggest waiting line is for Indian origin applicants. So I think I would expect that for the Indian origin immigrant high-tech worker, skilled worker, a Biden administration framework would be more welcoming than what we had seen in the Trump administration.
Right. Thank you so much. Now, I think our audience is patiently waiting for asking some questions, and I can see the chat box is full with questions on Russia, on H-1B visa, on China, and a lot other issues. So I'm sure we will cover a lot of ground, ones which we have not touched in the discussion so far. So the first person I would like to call is Mr. Narayan Kumar. Mr. Kumar, could you please unmute yourself, please? and ask your question.
Yeah, good evening. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Thank you, Ambassador, for a very enlightening and an interesting discussion on the incoming Biden administration. Mr. Shubhajit had actually started off the discussion by asking the questions which I had in mind. So I will just try to elaborate from there. Does India, Mr. Ambassador, have a contingency plan or a strategy in place in the event of the Biden administration resetting ties with Beijing and Islamabad? It is especially in context of the situation across the LAC, where we are having a standoff with China, and also the situation across the LOC from where we have this firefights which are ongoing. So whether any softening of the stance by Biden administration, which will have a cascading effect on Indian interests, does India have any contingency plan or strategy to counter this? Thank you.
Thank you, Narayan. I think it's an important question, and I think it's uppermost in the minds of many people. Now, of course, I don't speak for the government. I'm not in government, so you have to understand that framework. But having said that, I have studied India-US relationship deeply. And my experience and assessment has been that 4 factors historically have impacted this relationship. And if you look at these 4 factors at any point of time, you can explain what's going to happen. One is, what is the US global priority at a point of time? And based on that, how does the US look at the India relationship? Second, within the framework of its global priority, what is the relationship with Pakistan? And then how does it impact on India? Because, at the time of the Soviet Union, it found the Pakistan relationship as useful because Pakistan agreed to be part of the US-led military alliances, and India went for the policy of non-alignment because of its own interests. Third, again, because of its global priorities, what is its relationship with China? And then it impacts on India. And finally, what is the strength of the bilateral relationship? Now, in the early phase of the Biden administration, and of course, the global situation can change, international challenges can change, and we have to see how it evolves. But in the early phase of the Biden administration, for a while, they will find Pakistan a necessary partner in the context of what they want to do in Afghanistan. Because as Vice President, Joe Biden himself had pushed for a drawdown of US troops. And he had said that US should stop getting involved in forever wars. And he also, like Trump, wants to get out of Afghanistan. And if Pakistan plays its cards well, tries to show the US that it is cooperative, it is helping bring about reconciliation between Taliban and the Afghan government, the US would not generate pressure on Pakistan. But if they assess that Pakistan is not being a helpful partner, is continuing to provide support to terrorist groups, the US approach could change. And we have to watch that. All parts of the US system today recognize that China is a major challenge. And while there may be some nuancing by a Biden administration, and they will want to show, as I mentioned earlier, that they are handling it better than the Trump administration, and the aggressive rhetoric may come down, but the substance of the policy will remain. And they will also try and reach out to Europeans, other countries in Asia to see if they can come with a common approach on China, which would be an approach to meet the Chinese technological and military challenge. And that is going to be the overall defining priority for the US, including in a Biden administration in the coming years. Moving from there, they see the India relationship as a very important relationship, partly because of the strength in the bilateral dimension of the relationship. Our trade is almost $150 billion, which is important. Indians contribute to technology development in the US. We are an important partner for the US in the information technology sector, in the healthcare sector, and the Indian origin diaspora in the United States, 4 million strong. And you would have seen the kind of effort that President Trump made to reach out to the Indian origin diaspora, joining the Indian Prime Minister for the event in Houston last year, coming to Ahmedabad for the event with 100,000 Indians there as a signal to the Indian origin diaspora in the US. He made some gains because, for example, in his election with Hillary Clinton, he had got the votes about 17% of the Indian American community. This time it was estimated that he got the votes of 30%. So he made some gains. So again, the Indian origin diaspora also begins to play an important role. Till 2014, historically, there were only 3 Indian Americans in Congress. Since then, at any point of time, there have been 5 Indian Americans in Congress. And now a person of Indian origin is going to be a vice president in the United States, which is a major achievement. So that, again, is another factor that will be influencing overall. I mean, there'll be challenges, but influencing overall in a positive way the evolution of the India-US relationship. So I would believe that whatever be the dimensions of their relationship with Pakistan, with China, they will value the relationship with India and will define the policies keeping that in mind. And in fact, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris on 15th August this year, on our Independence Day, issued a very special message for the people of India, for the Indian American community, where they said that cross-border terrorism is unacceptable, signal to Pakistan, and there was a recognition of the need to respond to the challenge from China, and that was very clearly articulated.
Yeah, you very rightly pointed out these issues and challenges that the Biden administration faces from China, and I wanted to take you to the other challenge. There's a bipartisan consensus in Washington on the challenge from Russia. And that has emerged front and center in the last few years. And that, as you rightly pointed out earlier, that has emerged as a point of divergence between India and US. Now, one of the manifestations of this divergence has been that when India wants to get the S-400 air defense system from Russia, US threatens India with sanctions under CAATSA. And it is very difficult for India to not acquire that system because it's critical for national security reasons. Now, with Biden administration, what do you think? How will India negotiate this particular divergence? Will that be front and center? Will Biden be more accommodative on this issue when it comes to India's national security interests?
I think, as you mentioned, Shubhajit, this is clearly going to be an important issue to deal with. For India, our relationship earlier with the Soviet Union and now Russia is very, very important. The Soviet Union gave us military support, military supplies, political support at a time when it was not available from the West, be it the United States or others. And even today, as has been has come out in public documents, almost 60% of our defense inventory is of Russian origin. And that there are, in certain areas, we get technologies from Russia at competitive prices that are not available elsewhere. So India has to work out its own policies based on its own interests. Similarly, in the context of the challenges that we face from China, we would certainly not want that Russia go completely on the side of China. And we would like Russia to remain, at the very least, equidistant, if not on the side of India and not bit on the side of China. So therefore, it is important for India to sustain the relationship. Unfortunately, in the US, for various reasons, today there is a strong bipartisan consensus, which President Trump himself did not necessarily agree with, on responding to Russia with some very aggressive measures. In fact, the sanctions on Russia, the latest set of sanctions, were pushed by the US Congress. It did not come from the US administration. It came from the US Congress because they wanted to tie the hands of President Trump, preventing him to move forward positively with Russia. And in those sanctions, which has been described as CAATSA, Countering American Adversary Through Sanctions Act, purchase of major defense systems from Russia could become sanctionable. And the S-400 is a case in point. You may have seen that in the Defense Authorization Bill that has just been passed by US Congress, both the House and Senate, and has gone to President Trump for signature, there is a specific demand that Turkey be sanctioned for going ahead with the S-400 deal with Russia. Now, of course, Turkey's case is different. Turkey is a NATO country, and therefore it's a different level of cooperation that it has with the West. India's case is different. And from the various comments and writings that have come out in the public domain in India, it has been made clear to the US that the US would be making a mistake if it sanctioned India for the S-400. Because, as you build your relationship with the United States, one of the important things is the US has to be seen as a reliable partner. In the past, it was not always seen as a reliable partner. It was not a reliable partner in the 50s when we faced the challenge related to Jammu and Kashmir at the United Nations. It was certainly not a reliable partner in 1971 when we had the conflict with Pakistan in the context of East Pakistan and then leading to the emergence of Bangladesh. It was certainly not a reliable partner when it supported Pakistan and the ISI as it built up militant jihad to drive the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan. But since 2000, the US has been working to build a new relationship with India. And when you buy more and more defense supplies from a country, it must be seen as a reliable partner, that it will be there with you at a moment of crisis. And India has three other major defense partners: Russia, France, Israel. All three of them are seen as reliable partners. So the US must be seen as a reliable partner if it wants to continue building this relationship in a positive way. If the US then goes ahead and sanctions India for something, it will affect its own image as a reliable partner and will impact negatively on the evolution of the US-India relationship. And US needs to keep that in mind. And I think it was because of this that when the US Congress passed the CATSA bill originally, there was no provision for waiver, that the US administration had no capacity to give waiver from the sanctions. But the then US administration, especially the then US Defense Secretary, Jim Mattis, lobbied in Congress to give the president waiver provision. And so the president of the United States has the provision to waive the enforcement of sanctions. So I would hope and expect that if the situation reaches a certain point, that whoever is the US president would exercise that waiver and not impose sanctions on India, keeping in mind their own interest and the interest of US being seen as a reliable and important partner in India.
Right. That's a very well-made point. And I would now move to the next question. Mr. Milan Mehta, could you unmute yourself, please, and ask a question?
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Yeah, thank you for giving me the chance to speak. Sir, very informed and, it was an excellent presentation. My queries are looking to the need of Pakistan and balancing Russia. Will US side with India if China gives an excellent trade deal which can solve the US problems?
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Yes, I understand where your concern and question is coming from. And, I think, as I mentioned, President Biden will try to signal that his policy on China is more effective, it's a smarter policy. He will certainly lower the rhetoric. He'll try and see if he can bring Europeans on board. And Europeans themselves are divided. There's no common European approach as yet for a harder line policy on China. Germany, for example, which has heavy economic engagement with China, especially the German automobile industry. It sells about 1 million cars in the US. It sells 5 million cars in China. So they have a certain linkage with China, and they want to continue the policy of economic engagement, less action against China because of those concerns. So if the Chinese are smart, and everybody says they would probably want to offer to the incoming administration something positive, something on trade, to try and engage with them and see if some of the measures that President Trump has taken on tariffs and technology denials can be used by the Biden administration. Now, the President-elect Biden has himself said publicly that the phase one trade deal that President Trump has done, he will not remove that from the table immediately, that he will allow that to continue, which means that some of the tariffs that are there on China are going to continue for a while. Because if he tries to move away from those tariffs, then the Republicans and President Trump are going to criticize him very heavily. President Trump during his campaign had tried to put out that China wants Joe Biden to be elected because he would be softer on China. The Republicans are going to watch very closely the action that a Democratic administration takes related to China. More than that, watching carefully developments in the US, the statements coming out from the transition team, they want to put emphasis on getting the US economy back on track. They want to put emphasis on getting US to become again a technology leader. For that, they will need certain bills to pass in US Congress on a bipartisan basis. The one factor that will enable a bipartisanship to emerge on the economic and technological domain would be the projection of a challenge from China. And so when they project that there is a major challenge from China, that is what will bring the Democrats and Republicans together on economic and technological issues. So they are going to have to use that for their own reasons and to get the US economy back on track. So because of that, I think while there may be some softening, there is really no need to be overly concerned that the policy on China would see a 180-degree turnaround.
Let me kind of press you on this point because, I think, let me rephrase the question. If tomorrow there was a conflict between India and China, then do you think the US will stand up for India?
Now, question, Shubhajit, is what do you mean by stand up? Let's say in a Trump administration, there was a conflict. Do you think US troops would have gone to Ladakh to fight? That's not going to happen. And we don't expect that. So it's a question of what kind of support. You're looking at support in terms of availability of technology, availability of equipment that you need, sharing of information, sharing of intelligence, political support, continuing cooperation in the framework of the Indo-Pacific, enhancing maritime cooperation, because the maritime domain is important because a large part of China's trade passes through the Indo-Pacific region. And so I would feel that a Biden administration would be no less supportive than what we've seen the Trump administration to have been on this issue.
Right. Fair point. There, since the previous questioner mentioned about the trade deal between China and the US, I would sort of bring you on the Indo-US trade deal that has been in the offing in negotiations for many, many years now. Sometimes we talk about mega deal, a package deal, a mini deal, and sort of each time there is hope, but there has been irreconcilable differences, which are, I can understand there are only 5 to 10% of those differences, but those differences matter. And that's why there has been, although the trade volumes have increased dramatically in the last 2 decades, but it is not going beyond a point. So do you think with a Biden administration in power, where you would think that America first issue won't be a big determinant of the Biden administration's policy, will that be a sort of a kind of, that is something that can happen, or that will elude again? And again, to quote Mr. Vijay Gokhale here in one of the pieces that he wrote for us, that America will become more transactional and less generous. So in light of this, what do you think would be Biden's approach?
So, Shubhajit, you've been writing on foreign policy issues very regularly. And you may recall that it was in September when the Indian Prime Minister had met President Trump in New York on the margins of UNGA. The word had emerged that a trade agreement, a mini trade agreement, would be finalized soon. That was September 2019.
I was there at that room when that
Now we are at December 2020, and that has not happened. And it has not happened because there are existing interests on both sides who do not find it possible to work out the package. Because there are production interests, there are trade interests, the interests in the medical equipment sector, dairy sector. And because of that, it didn't work out. But the important thing was that because the two sides engaged in very serious discussions, the sharpness of rhetoric related to that went away. Now, Biden has said that he is not going to enter into any fresh trade agreements after he takes office until he has revived the competitiveness of the American worker. The second thing he has said is that any trade agreement he does, representatives of labor and the environmental sector would be on the table when those agreements are being discussed. So concerns related to labor, wages, climate change, environment would be important part of the discussions. He has also said that he will push for reshoring of jobs to the United States. He will be pushing for Buy America, especially in government purchases. Therefore, I would feel that if we are looking at existing patterns of production and trade, an early trade agreement with the United States is going to be difficult. But I feel we should approach it differently. As our discussion has shown, there is tremendous geostrategic convergence between India and the US. But our economic relationship does not quite match the convergence we see in the strategic and political dimension of the relationship. Our trade for India, it's important, a total about $150 billion. Again, for India, it is important because with the US, we have a trade surplus, although we are an overall trade deficit country. It is also important because the information technology sector is very important for India, generates almost 9% of our GDP. And a bulk of production there goes to the United States. But for the US, compared to its trade relationship with China, which is of the order of almost $600 billion, is not quite there. So what I think we should do is focusing on the emerging areas. As COVID impact has shown, the way we live, the way we work is going to change dramatically. There is a perfect storm of technology coming. Many analysts have pointed out. If you look at artificial intelligence, quantum computing, cyber, data, biotechnology, all this is going to completely transform how we live and work. It is better for us, for governments on both sides, for businesses on both sides, to get involved in a very deep dive discussion on what is the new relationships and patterns of cooperation we can build in these sectors. Once we build those linkages, interactions, patterns of cooperation, patterns of trade, then look at the kind of agreement, kind of regulations, kind of framework of cooperation that we should bring about, which would enable that. And there we would not be impacting on existing interests, but creating new interests, new areas of production and cooperation. That would be a far more effective way to proceed to build a new framework for the India-US economic relationship.
Right. Well said, that is. The next question is from Mr. Chalapati Somasi. Please unmute yourself and ask your question, please.
Yeah, can you hear me, sir?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. You have slightly preempted my question in terms of the new interests that could come in the pandemic era. Can you highlight some of such issues in things like healthcare and education in particular? And on a second question that I have, the issue of patents has been an irritant in the Indo-US dialogues. Can you, kindly give your views on that? Thank you.
Okay, before I move on to the next, I would like to club a couple of questions so that, since we are almost toward the end of our time. So could I call Mr. Amar Rao? Mr. Amar Rao, could you please unmute yourself and ask a question, please?
So, Mr. Arun, Biden was the most senior dissenting voice against a surge in Afghanistan back in 2008 during Barack Obama time. Now, the point is that given the dynamics at play, India is reduced to a mute spectator, as the other countries are. So my question is that how will the new presidency is going to build a strategic advantage in Afghanistan with the help and support of India? Thank you.
Yeah. Should I take one more or two? You could take two.
I leave it to you. You choose whatever. You can take one more and then we can.
One more and then. Okay, Ms. Mansi Mote, could you please unmute yourself and ask a question?
Yes, good evening, sir. So my question was that what will be the benefits to the Indians after this new government comes in, and how much better scope will be there for the purpose of education and the further H-1B visa?
Right. Thank you. So we have questions on the health, which is very topical. We have question on Afghanistan and the question of students. Obviously, and Mansi is a student, and she's and this is one of the questions. There are hundreds of questions on education and students issues. Please.
So let me start with Afghanistan. Because, a lot of people have been talking about that. Shobhajit, my first visit to Afghanistan was on 20th November 2001, a week after the Taliban had left. And you may recall that since 1996, India had not been present in Afghanistan, because once the Taliban came to power, we shut our embassy to protect our personnel and moved out of there. When we went back in 2001, we started the work of our embassy. We started economic assistance projects in Afghanistan. And today it has been assessed that India's influence in Afghanistan, in terms of the influence on the people, how people perceive the work India has done, is rated very, very highly, because the kind of projects we've done, infrastructure projects, dams, road construction, school rebuilding, rebuilding of hospital, food supply to Afghanistan, and most public opinion polls done, including by Americans who've been very active there, shows that the response to India has been the most favorable. So India's influence in Afghanistan is because of how the Afghan people look at India, and they see India as an important partner. Now, in terms of the developments happening now, clearly it is led by how the US sees its interests. And it's not just, not that India is not necessarily telling US what it should do, but even the Europeans who are close partners with the US and are present there in the framework of NATO are sometimes surprised by the decisions that the US takes, or the decision that President Trump took to suddenly bring down the level of troops in Afghanistan to 2,500. So that's something we have to contend with, that the US will take decisions in its own interest. US leaders will take decisions based on their own political compulsions. We have to work to preserve and enhance our own interests. And I think India has done that very well since 2001 by building a strong relationship with the Afghan government and with the people, and that will stand us in good stead whatever changes happen in Afghanistan. In terms of healthcare, I think this is an area with tremendous potential for cooperation. We've cooperated well in terms of vaccines in the past. Again, that will be an important area going ahead. We have cooperated well for infectious diseases. The Center for Disease Control in the US, which is a very important institution, has partnered with institutions in India. And in the US, there is a recognition that as the US wants to lower healthcare costs there, because healthcare costs are very, very high, insurance costs are very high, then partnership with Indian pharmaceutical companies who are strong in generics would be an important dimension of that. And a significant part of US medical supplies, especially generics, are sourced from India. And that's something we can build on more. So that's an area I think we should certainly work on. I think education will be an important area for cooperation. The Indian government has also come out with a new education policy, where there is enhanced space and scope for partnership with foreign institutions. So we should see how we can use that for our own advantage. And of course, I have found that Indian students who go to the US, and many of them used to ask me that, after studying here, should we continue to live and work in the US? Should we go back to India? And I used to say that, look, whatever decision you take is your personal decision. But wherever you are, be it in India, whether you're in the US, you should look at contributing to development in India. And that would be a sort of give back to your own country, to your own society, and perhaps also contribute to increasing trade and economic relationship between India and the US. And that would be an important way of going forward. So I think under a Biden administration, the dimensions of cooperation in the education sector would be looked at very positively, and they would certainly look at sort of enabling more visas for Indian students. There's been a certain tightening on visas for Chinese students because they felt that Chinese scholars are stealing technology from the US. And therefore, because of that tightening, I think more space would be created for Indian students. And I think that's an opportunity that we can certainly tap. In terms of intellectual property, my own assessment is that the US policy on that is not justified because they go several notches beyond what has been agreed in the framework of multilateral negotiations. So it's their own unilateral position that they've taken on intellectual property issues, which they try to enforce through the strength of their economic power. Now, clearly, that's something, this unilateral assessment that we cannot accept. But at the same time, when there is a power, you have to deal with it. You have to handle it. And so we have to work our way through the US system, pointing out the justification in India's position. And also, we used to make the argument that many US leaders, and for example, when I was there at the time of the Obama administration, many leaders in the Obama administration had said that they see the rise of India to be in US interest. And our argument was that you cannot think of a rise of India without the economic rise of India. They should not take adversarial economic measures that hinder economic developments in India. So I think that this argument has to go on, and we have to convince US leaders who are working based on their own political compulsions that the policies that India is adopting, including in the economic domain, is well justified for India, and they have to look at those with empathy.
Yeah. Before I move on to the next set of questions, I would like to ask you about the Indian diaspora, which is very active and which is a very vibrant stakeholder in India-US relationship. In fact, they played a huge role when during the India-US nuclear deal as well, were lobbying for Indian interests. And so how do you, and you see that, Mr. Modi, he has sort of put diaspora front and center of the relationship. Now, it can cut both ways. It can, as we saw in the on the CA-NRC or Kashmir issue or the nuclear deal issue. So it can work both ways. So how do you think this particular rise of Indian diaspora, and you pointed out their political involvement and in the House and now in the Senate, how will that play out from now? And we already know there are a lot of Indian Americans in the Biden administration that are going to play a role. Last time there was an ambassador from nominated by Obama Biden administration was an Indian American, Richard Verma, who's your counterpart. You know him very well. So how will that play out in the Biden administration?
Shujit, as we discussed earlier, the Indian origin diaspora has the potential to play a very important cementing role in the evolution of the India-US relationship. The strength of this diaspora is estimated today to be more than 4 million. According to the latest census assessments done, about 1.8 million were eligible voters. And obviously that was important, and that's why President Trump himself gave a lot of effort to attention to this community. And it was for this reason that he went to Houston in September last year and to Ahmedabad in February this year. Even in the 2016 election, he had focused on the community because at a time when he was not getting much support, a section of the community had come out to support him, raise funds for him. You may recall that he had recorded a campaign video speaking in Hindi, Ab ki baar Trump Sarkar, and that was in 2016.
Mr. Modi repeated at
in Houston, yeah. So that it was an effort that he was making. The largest single country caucus in the US House of Representatives and the Senate is the India caucus. And that is because congressmen, senators want to become members of this caucus to signal to their Indian American constituents that we are showing interest in India and we are showing interest in the India-US relationship. We are mindful of your concerns. And so again, that's an important thing. I found when I was serving there that very often congressmen and senators invited me to join with them in their interaction with some of the constituents. Of course, as a foreign representative, I cannot get involved in political activity, and you could not get involved in any fundraising activity. So that was the way. But sort of a social interaction as a signal that they were attaching importance to India. So I think this would be an important dimension. I have noticed since the time of the Obama administration that more and more Indian Americans are coming into administration and into the Congress as staffers. We now have, for the last 3 election cycles, 5 Indian Americans in Congress. Under President Obama, the highest level position was a sub-cabinet position. Under President Trump, it was a cabinet position. Nikki Haley as U.S. permanent representative to UN. President-elect Biden has already nominated, and of course she will have to be confirmed, Neera Tanden, to head the Office of Management and Budget, a very key position. And of course, Kamala Harris as the Vice President-elect. So, and many others in the administration, Vivek Murthy as the Surgeon General. So the Indian American community is going to play a very, very important role, and that would be a cementing dimension. But there will be challenges. There are sections of the community who may think differently on different issues, and therefore their argumentation, their advocacy on many of those issues may differ from other sections of the community or may differ from positions of the government of India. And so we have to just accept that and work our way around that, because people will base their politics wherever they are located based on the compulsions of that society, not necessarily the compulsions in India. And then we have to factor that in and work with that.
Right. So I would call the next caller would be Mr. Pratyush. Mr. Pratyush, if you could unmute yourself and ask a question. Mr. Pratyush?
He's not there.
Okay. So could we move to Ms. Chavi?
Yes. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. I am Chavi, and I would like to ask Mr. Singh, sir, do you think that USA under Biden will attempt to reclaim the title of upholder of global order, which was resigned by Trump in 2016 when he came up with America First?
Thank you. Thank you, Chavi. Can I call another question from Mr. Pradeep Wagh? Mr. Wagh, if you could unmute yourself and ask your question.
Am I audible, sir?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. It has been a great exposition. Arun Singh ji, I thank you for your powerful thoughts. I speak with a very limited understanding of international relations in South Asia, especially as a past student of Asian Institute, and then recently as a member of International Service for Rotary. I found that the relationship on a people-to-people basis with Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and even Pakistan were very good at a people-to-people basis. But this is not being borne out on the macroscopic geopolitical level. And my concern is more about the increasing aggressiveness of India's neighboring countries, China and Pakistan both. It appears that our Western neighbor has already set up favorable advocacy with the incoming US president. But my question is then, what kind of advocacy initiatives has India taken, especially now, to safeguard and get support to its own geopolitical interests vis-a-vis the neighbors in the new dispensation under Mr. Joe Biden?
Thank you. Sir, please go ahead.
So on the first question on the issue related to global order, President Trump, although he had spoken about that earlier, even before he became an sort of active candidate in 2015-16, about America needing to focus more on its own needs, he defined the policy of America first because it appealed to a section of American voters. Since 1990, especially after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the US sort of led the world towards globalization and towards globalization of production, trade. US economy overall benefited. The elite in the US benefited. Top 1% in the US generates 40% of the income and 40% of the wealth. But the middle 40% of the population, they saw their wages stagnate over this period. In this segment, death rates went up, drug addiction went up, longevity came down. So Trump felt that the policy of America first will appeal to this segment of the population and they would come out and vote for it, which they did. And even in this cycle, as you would have seen, more than 70 million people Americans have voted for Donald Trump, because they believe that the kind of policies of globalization that were followed by the US since 1990 has not worked for them, aside from other concerns related to rise of power of minority groups within the United States. The signal from the Biden team is clear that the globalization of the past is over. And that, he would also focus on production in America, reshoring in America, buy America, enhancing the competitiveness of the American worker, but that he believes that America cannot do it alone and that America needs to build a framework of a cooperative relationship with its allies and partners to shape the international environment in a way that serves US interests. And that could be his effort. Therefore, certainly he will try to put more focus on multilateralism, put more focus on a kind of global order that, as they say, is based on rule of law, more stability, conducive to US interests. Otherwise, they feel that if the US does not do that, China will step into the vacuum, as China has done it. They've tried to signal since 2017 that they are the upholder of global norms. US is in retreat. US is in decline. China, for example, has won elections to 4 of the 15 UN technical agencies. Many have argued that the WHO has come under influence of China. So the US effort would be that the US comes again in a leadership role in the global context and pushes back on what China has tried to do. So I think that's the direction in which we would expect them to go.
Okay. We have really gone past the time, but I think a couple of issues still remain on the table. So I would not let you go, because you are such a valuable expert and we've got you time here. So one issue that I think, which is there, a lot of questions on the chat box that has emerged, is the issue of human rights. Now, this issue, which is important for many Americans in the administration, in the current administration and the Democratic Party, and we saw in the last year and a half, especially, the Trump administration did not lean on the Indian government in a manner which many would have expected, despite pressure from the US Congress and civil society. We all remember the hearings in the US Congress on CAA, NRC. So from Kashmir to CAA, NRC, how would the Biden administration, which has a very pronounced human rights approach, and Biden, he's been vocal about it. Tony Blinken has been, himself, his stepfather was a refugee, and he has a lot of empathy for that cause. So how would the Biden administration, with Tony Blinken as Secretary of State, deal with these issues of human rights when it comes to India?
Mm-hmm. No, important question, Shubhajit. So we have to recognize that US leaders, US politicians will base their politics based on their compulsions, their constituency interests. And therefore, they will take a certain position on issues that they articulate as human rights based on how it plays out for them and their voters. We have to accept that. And you would have seen the kind of comments that came from Bernie Sanders at one stage, comments that came from Kamala Harris, from Pramila Jayapal, who is an influential congresswoman now. She has just been elected chair of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, and more than 100 representatives in the House of Representatives are member of that wing, and we have to factor that in. But at the same time, people in the Biden camp have said that any differences with India on issues related to human rights would be based on a discussion among friends, and that you come and discuss. And my own sense is that India takes its decision based on its own interests. We don't have to be unnecessarily insecure or on the defensive related to decisions that we take. For the US has its own challenges, systemic racism. You have seen what's happening on voter suppression, gerrymandering of districts. So all societies face challenges. And therefore, any India-US discussion or dialogue related to human rights should be as a dialogue among friends who are trying to understand each other, who want to advance their relationship, and a recognition that every society has challenges that it is dealing with, and the US has its own challenges. And again, it's not just the situation now or the situation after 2014. Even earlier, there were sections of people in the US, including sections of the Indian origin community, that had done advocacy against India or advocacy against positions of the Indian government in the US Congress or with the US administration for policies they didn't agree with. So this is not really something new. And we have to just accept that each society has its own politics, and you work around that, keeping in view the larger interest.
So discuss among friends is what will be the watchword, I would imagine. The other issue that has also cropped up in a lot of the questions that we received is the issue of climate change. Mm-hmm. And that, is front and center, as you rightly pointed out, as a priority for this administration, this incoming administration. And coincidentally, there's a climate ambition summit being held today, right now, as we speak, in which Prime Minister Modi is speaking, French President Macron, Boris Johnson is speaking. Now, after almost a 4-year hiatus, this particular issue will be front on the agenda for the US administration. Now, does that mean it will be about building more pressure on India to sort of go and meet its commitments, or India can actually turn the table and ask for more financing, more funding for adopting better climate change technologies, better green technologies? Would that be the case? How will that play out?
So climate change, as you mentioned, Shubhajit, will clearly come under more focus. And President-elect Biden has signaled that he will rejoin the Paris Agreement. He will convene an early summit of major emitters. His very appointment of John Kerry as special envoy, giving him a seat at the National Security Council, reflects the kind of attention that would be paid to this issue and priority given. John Kerry, both as Senator and as Secretary of State, had been very aggressive in his advocacy on climate change issues. I think we have to make sure that as the discussion progresses, some of the important principles of common but differentiated responsibilities, some of the important principles of historical emissions, because large part of the challenge related to climate change has been done by countries that industrialized early, the developed countries of the world. Their aim would be to move away from that and focus on the situation as of today without getting into historical emissions. And that battle will continue. Clearly, countries like India would like to put focus on the issue of financing, technology transfers, to enable the disadvantaged countries to cope with this better. They would not like to emphasize that because they just want every country to be able to take action on its own. So I think my sense is that what the Indian government has tried to do for past several years show that it is a leader in this area. For example, the International Solar Alliance. We have spoken of disaster resilient infrastructure. Most assessments done show that India has taken much more action since Paris than the United States has done. And there's a lot of catching up that the United States has to do. So if looking ahead, we see that we need to build on newer areas of technology, then naturally renewable energy, green technology would be the kind of emphasis that could be given now as India builds manufacturing sector in a major way, or goes into newer technology areas that we spoke about, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, cyber, data. So if we keep that framework in mind, I think we can finesse the challenge that we face in this sector. So again, I would feel the best approach would be to be mindful of the differentiation that has existed and yet play a leadership role in approaching new technologies to build the subsequent path of development in India.
Right. So before I wrap up, one last final question, because you spent 8 years there during interacting with the Obama-Biden administration. Now, in Washington, they say personnel is policy. So now with Kamala Harris as vice president, Tony Blinken as Secretary of State, Jake Sullivan as the NSA, Avril Haines as the DNI, all of them have to be confirmed by the House, by the Congress. Now, many of these appointments, as a Washington insider recently told me, that these are the Obama-walas, basically those who have worked in the Obama administration. So what do these appointments tell you? And if you could share some of your personal experiences from interacting with, say, Tony Blinken or Sullivan, that would be fascinating to hear.
So I think when I look at the the announcements that have been made so far, it is a clear signal that these are people that President-elect Biden is comfortable with, and people who worked with him closely. Tony Blinken was his national security advisor before he became the deputy national security advisor for the president and then deputy secretary of state. Jake Sullivan was his national security advisor till 2014 before he joined to lead the Hillary Clinton campaign. I had occasion to interact with many of them. Jake Sullivan used to be the director of policy planning in the State Department when I was there. Tony Blinken, in his various capacities, Deputy Secretary of State, Deputy NSA, National Security Advisor to Vice President. Avril Haines was Deputy National Security Advisor. So the clear sense that I got was that all of them are very aware and very committed to the India relationship. And during the time of the Obama administration, there were many firsts that happened that we tend to forget. In 2009, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh had been invited by President Obama as the first state visitor of the Obama administration. Yeah. And in the United States, state visits are a very clear signal because they normally host only 1 or 2 state visits in any year. And President Obama deliberately selected the Indian Prime Minister because he wanted to signal that there was going to be continuity from the time of President Bush, from the time of the Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement. Because you may recall that President Obama himself, initially as a senator, was not very supportive of the Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement. And he had done some amendments which were called killer amendments, which would completely kill the deal. But then, he had backed off from those. But once he became president, the signal was that the Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement was now settled law. The framework of cooperation brought by the Bush administration would be continued and the relationship would be taken forward. So that was one. And then they also declared India a major defense partner. And no other country in the world has this status. And it was done deliberately because India is not an ally. And yet they wanted to give India the same level of technology access as their closest allies and partners. So they created this new framework of a major defense partner only for India and to enable high-level technology releases for India. Vice President Biden had come to India in 2013, and he visited India, and speaking at the Mumbai Stock Exchange, he said that he would like to reiterate what President Obama had said, that the India-US relationship would be the defining relationship of the 21st century. And he spoke about what he had said in 2006, that by 2020, he wants the India-US relationship to be the closest. And we are in 2020 now. So I would say that given the fact that many in the Obama-Biden team are going to continue in the Biden-Harris team, I am very confident, based on my interactions with them when I was there, that the India-US relationship would continue to strengthen over the next 4 years.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Singh. That was indeed a fascinating and insightful conversation. We really got a sense of the incoming Biden administration's possible priorities and how things will impact for India. Thank you so much, Mr. Singh, again, for analyzing the developments with your unparalleled depth and breadth of experience and explaining the issues to our readers and viewers in a very easy to understand manner. The key takeaway, as I understand now, is over the last 20 years or so, every US president, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump, have had differences on many issues. They say that if you put all four of these characters, of these political leaders in one room, they would debate and argue on every single issue. But if there is one issue on which they would have a common agenda, a convergence of views, and agree on it, will be to build a stronger relationship with India. What that means is that there has been a tradition of bipartisan support in favor of better ties with India, and every US president has made it better than what he or so far he inherited from his predecessor over the last 2 decades. So to cut a long story short, there is actually no reason to believe that Biden will not continue the tradition. But of course, he will have his own style, his own nuances, his own challenges, and will put his personal stamp on the relationship. That brings us to the end of this particular session. Thank you to all the viewers from all of the country. Some have joined from different parts of the world. Thank you to all of you from the Indian Express family for joining in today and hearing out patiently for this discussion which went past the allocated time. Your questions really enriched the conversation. For those who missed the webinar, the video of this interaction will be online shortly. To read, listen, and view more of Indian Express's explanatory journalism, do log on to our website, indianexpress.com. Until the next edition of the Express Explained Live, stay safe and stay tuned. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.